Hello, so this video is going to be comparing and contrasting the ENFJ with the ESFJ, and as per usual with the CPT type comparison series, we're not going to be relying upon superficial stereotypes in order to help you tell the difference between the two. Rather, we're going to be taking a plunge deep down into the underlying cognition of each of these types. So both the ESFJ and the ENFJ share the same dominant function. This is extroverted feeling. And no, this does not make for a fluffy teddy bear going around hugging and kissing everybody they meet. Far from it, actually. With extroverted feeling as a primary gateway of the psyche, this actually manifests as a pretty serious individual, really prioritizing their role within society, within the collective. Whereas extroverted feeling convergent auxiliaries such as the ESTP, the ENTP, have a very oftentimes playful use of this function. The ESFJ and the ENFJ tend to really model their identity around it, and as such take the corresponding social order of the external world very seriously. And they take their role within this world very seriously as well. And while of course this is very much a universal human trait, it is worth mentioning both of these types do tend to be especially sensitive to, attentive to social feedback, and will go to very great lengths in order to meet the expectations of those around them. So extroverted feeling in the dominant position isn't just some passive bystander, but rather a function that takes charge of the social world around oneself. And owing to the aforementioned sensitivity to social feedback, competence tends to be pretty high on these types' respective list of priorities. But just as the ENFJ and the ESFJ really take charge of their role within society, so do they much more divergently observe introverted thinking parameters. And this is where we get into the introverted thinking oppositional function. You see where extroverted feeling energies are often directed more towards action, introverted thinking energies, being much more divergent in this case, are directed much more towards observation. And I've got to say, this function tends to be very, very underrated within each of these types. It is the ENFJ and the ESFJ, owing to the hyperdivergence of this function, who tend to excel the most naturally out of all of the 16 types at precisely observing and adhering to introverted thinking parameters. Not only do these types tend to be very skilled individuals, but the adherence to introverted thinking parameters coupled with a valuing of extroverted feeling feedback practically propel excellence. But it is worth mentioning this tends to make both of these types their own worst critic. And they tend to hold themselves to very, very high standards. They not only want to meet their own introverted thinking criteria, but they also want to meet the expectations of those around them and indeed society as a whole. And the type's natural gravitation towards taking on additional extroverted feeling responsibility may yet exacerbate matters further, and thus it is not entirely surprising within this age of global interconnectivity that these types may end up withdrawing from dominant position altogether, becoming much more introverted. And now do not get me wrong, even the most introverted variant of the ENFJ and the ESFJ will still feel most fulfilled when maximizing their role within society. But within this age that we live in, it is oftentimes necessary for these types to implement certain precautions to avoid certain negative social feedback loops. But I would say as a result of this, the ENFJ and the ESFJ tend to be the most likely out of all of the 16 types to develop a very fluid dominant axis, essentially rotating on an axis in order for introverted thinking to take the lead. And while of course this is not going to be true for all extroverted feeling dominance across the board, those who do activate this particular fluid axis will tend to become very philosophical and analytical in their own right. And after all, since extroverted feeling here is valued so highly, a degree of extroverted feeling divergence is practically necessary in order to gain social feedback in the first place. So a quick summary before we start telling the types apart from one another. Extroverted feeling in the dominant position is a convergent function. Therefore, these types are acting upon the social world around us, building reputations and effectively traversing societal infrastructure. And indeed, both academic and even corporate environments whereby there is a ladder of excellence to climb tend to be fairly well suited to each of these types. However, we are still talking about extroverted feeling dominance here, so there still has to be a certain significance of societal role within any given criteria. And by contrast, introverted thinking is in the oppositional position, being much more divergent by nature. Because of the divergent attitude of this introverted thinking function, the criterion in question is often very easily observed by these types. And with so much energy being directed towards the effective observation of these frameworks, there is a natural inclination here for performance and expertise. And this is because such expertise, skill sets, knowledge, these are being hard-coded Owing to the hyperdivergence of this introverted thinking, frameworks are rendered so static as to be much more easily observed and abided by. After all of these values are always changing, it would be exceedingly difficult to observe them in the first place. But whereas these types do share the same dominant and oppositional function, the auxiliaries of each of these types are completely versed. You have extroverted sensing as the auxiliary of the ENFJ, and extroverted intuition as the auxiliary of the ESFJ. And what does this mean? Well, first and foremost, the ENFJ, employing as they do an extroverted sensing auxiliary to their extroverted feeling dominant function, tend to be much more one-on-one by nature. They can even be very private individuals, generally preferring a much more intense and intimate one-on-one social encounter over, say, a group scenario or having many acquaintances. Owing to the highly concrete and intense nature of extroverted sensing, the ENFJ tends to really hone in and lock on to a very intensely experienced portion of external reality. With extroverted intuition, this very broad external lens acting as auxiliary to their extroverted feeling dominant function, the ESFJ tends to distribute their social energies across a much wider social atmosphere, even tending to have a wider circle of acquaintances, for example, than the ENFJ. Generally speaking, the ESFJ is much happier to enter into a group dynamic and start to control the ebb and flow of social energies within that particular setting. And of course, while this is not a universal law, the general trend is for the ESFJ to have a wider circle of acquaintances, especially as it concerns a more immediate community. And since the ESFJ is not quite as locked on to a specific extroverted feeling moment, they do tend to have a much more natural sense of extroverted feeling, flow, and contingency, with the ESFJ's ability to synergize with a respective group actually blending quite well with their natural desire for social variety. And, contrary to the S within their respective MBTI type code, the ESFJ actually does experience external reality, especially as concerns a social situation, in a more abstract and fluid manner to that of the ENFJ. But it is very important to note not everybody has a fully activated convergent auxiliary. Those of a much more divergent persuasion, say a divergent subtype, will still tend to fall into the reverse auxiliary of their respective authority function. So an ESFJ falling into extroverted sensing and an ENFJ falling into extroverted intuition. And it is very important to bear in mind that distinction. Particularly introverted ESFJs and ENFJs may not value their convergent auxiliary as much as more convergent subtypes. However, this is only half of the story, since these dominant functions we've just visited, for example extroverted feeling and extroverted sensing within an ENFJ, are very much informed by the functions that naturally oppose them. So within ENFJ, yes, you have a introverted thinking oppositional function, but this function has an auxiliary function of introverted intuition, and the implications of this are twofold. First and foremost, introverted intuition is the primary lens through which the type gazes upon their internal frameworks. This makes the type highly principle-driven, highly holistic in their perception of internal logic. And as such, the ENFJ does not act so much at the behest of a very detailed code of conduct as much as they do general laws and principles. And if one of these principles were to contradict another one, the ENFJ would tend to experience a high degree of internal dissonance. And being a naturally divergent thinker, and therefore somebody who much prefers to observe logic than act upon it, the ENFJ does tend to place a lot of emphasis onto ensuring they, for example, are citing from accurate sources. And indeed, this gravitation towards creating a vast bedrock of underlying principles does allow for the acquisition of extensive knowledge in many different areas, and can, on occasion, result in this type being mistyped as a thinking type altogether. And the second ramification of this introverted intuitive divergent auxiliary within the ENFJ is its role as a type's authority function, and owing to its oftentimes highly future tense orientation, the ENFJ is unsurprisingly, in my experience, the most likely type out of all 16 types to create a regimented 5 or 10 year plan of their future. And while such extremes of internal vision forming are not going to apply to all ENFJs, it does tend to lend the ENFJ a certain unstoppable attitude as they anchor into the present, extroverted sensing, at the behest of an internal vision, introverted intuition. But this internal vision can be as related to self-realization as it can be to fulfilling a certain societal role or maximizing one's own industry. And the ESFJ, by contrast, has a divergent auxiliary of introverted sensing. As auxiliary to their oppositional function of introverted thinking, this tends to lend the ESFJ a much more precise and even analytical perception of their respective introverted thinking frameworks. And therefore, whereas the ENFJ is the one who leans more towards a grand overview, it is the ESFJ who likes to really zoom in to the very details of the subject matter, making sure every brick within this introverted thinking structure is accounted for. And this does lend the ESFJ a certain introverted thinking pragmatism, as they want to make sure every component is 100% reliable. However, before I proceed any further, I want to point out I'm not talking in absolutes here. The ENFJ can effectively dip into introverted sensing perception of their introverted thinking, just as the ESFJ can zoom out in order to encompass the overarching principle. The ENFJ may start with the big picture and proceed to zoom in on the details, whereas the ESFJ may start with the details and proceed to zoom out in order to consult the principle involved. And I have to say, out of all of the 16 types, it is oftentimes the ESFJ who excels the most within fields that require exact attention to very specific introverted thinking values, where, one mistake, one error in judgment can result in a catastrophe. An astronaut comes to mind. And being as it is the authority function of the ESFJ, introverted sensing tends to really rein in the exploration of extroverted intuition, instilling a highly pragmatic agenda for this particular type. And while, of course, introverted sensing is not a universal recall function, when you make this function divergent, such as in this case, the ability to recall specific memories is definitely enhanced. This is because, as opposed to an introverted sensing dominant, somebody with, say, an introverted sensing authority function, such as the ESFJ, will spend much energy observing introverted sensing more than they are acting upon it. And it's not unusual for the ESFJ to be able to precisely recall and reflect upon something that happened 2 weeks ago in order to optimize the performance. And with this introverted sensing function being in the authority position here, the ESFJ may even have a more naturally nostalgic nature. And out of all of the 16 types, it is the ESFJ who is most likely to, emphasis there on likely, manifest a certain natural consecration of tradition. And this is not to say the ESFJ is innately traditional, but an extroverted feeling dominant function coupled with an introverted sensing authority function does tend to ensue a higher proclivity towards human ceremony and ritual. But just as these types differ in their use of introverted thinking, so do they differ in their use of extroverted thinking. The ENFJ essentially dips down from extroverted feeling and extroverted sensing into extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition. So when it comes to the employment of this extroverted thinking codec within this type, they're essentially spreading their energies across a much larger portion of the external landscape. As such, the ENFJ tends to take charge of a host of moving parts in order to ensure that NI vision is realized. And just as how extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition tends to seek variety in its oftentimes conceptual innovation, so does the ENFJ tend to abstain from a much more precise extroverted sensing employment of this extroverted thinking codec. And indeed, by way of general trend, the ENFJ tends to prefer to delegate responsibility of detailed execution and fact-checking to other people as they maintain their extroverted intuitive extroverted thinking gaze and responsibility. And the ESFJ, by contrast, is the exact opposite of this, dipping down as they do from extroverted feeling and extroverted intuition. The ESFJ in their employment of extroverted thinking alongside, in this case, extroverted sensing tends to prefer to really hone in to any given detail. They really excel at ensuring the task is completed as precisely as possible. And again, by way of general trend, as effective as the ESFJ naturally is at communal social organization when it comes to things of a much more mechanistic nature, they prefer to hone in on a single task and not be distracted by too much only marginally relevant information. However, when it comes to introverted feeling employment, both of these types actually have two different modes. The first mode is accessing this introverted feeling space from an extroverted feeling perspective. That is to say, for as long as the ESFJ and the ENFJ are surrounded by extroverted feeling stimuli, they are quite easily dipping down into introverted feeling, cross-referencing external concept against internal self-concept. And in these instances, the opposing orientation to the convergent auxiliary is actually relatively conscious. The ENFJ will be happily dipping down into introverted feeling and introverted sensing, just as the ESFJ will be dipping down into introverted feeling and introverted intuition. However, it is still important to note this particular auxiliary to introverted feeling, although it is highly conscious in this particular instance, it is still much more convergent than it is divergent. And as such, there's a great degree of introverted feeling adaptability and convergent expression. but not so much in the way of static observation. So when engaged within this particular setting, the ENFJ is experiencing emotions very acutely and are expressing their very niched down and solid identity with a great deal of precision. And again, the ESFJ is the exact opposite of this. Within this same communal setting, the ESFJ will be experiencing introverted feeling in a much more introverted intuitive manner, manifesting their identity in a much more archetypal fashion, and with general emotional fluctuations being a lot more sudden but altogether more transient. The saying, swift to anger, swift to forgive, does tend to apply more in this particular case. And in terms of communal alignment, just as the ENFJ tends to experience a much more niched down identity, that of the ESFJ tends to be a lot broader and all-encapsulating. And this can very much affect the interests and pursuits of each of these types. And those ESFJs who rely less upon a very specific archetype in order to encapsulate their identity can tend to entertain myriad different hobbies, pursuits, and interests without feeling their identity is threatened. But there is also a second employment of introverted feeling within each of these types, and I call this the dormant state. The ENFJ, when absent a social setting, will tend to bypass introverted sensing and dip down into a much more murky introverted intuition. Here, introverted feeling and introverted intuition are drawing inspiration from the potential for radical self-transformation. And once this inspiration has taken place, the ENFJ will once again step out into the collective and niche down their identity anew. And by contrast, the ESFJ absent a social setting will be bypassing introverted intuition in order to dip down into a much more murky introverted sensing alongside introverted feeling. And here the ESFJ does tend to be a lot more naturally nostalgic, dipping down into introverted sensing in order to consult what has been previously found to be meaningful. And once this inspiration has taken place, they will be once again stepping out into the collective in order to expand their identity anew. So that concludes the video. Thank you for watching, especially if you made it this far. You were awesome. And if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button below. And if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the contents of this video or just find it generally interesting, be sure to share it with them as well. If you are interested in exploring the fundamentals behind CPT, I highly recommend checking out a CPT ebook. And if you yourself are interested in what type you might be, or would like to know just about how your type applies more specifically to you as an individual, I highly recommend checking out a CPT type service. But just a reminder for anybody who goes to book a session on a website, I am in the UK, so you will have to convert from GMT time zone. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel and Ethereum at additional level, joining the live streams, the Patreon-only Discord server, it would be absolutely amazing to see you there. So that's it from me, and I'll be back in a week or two. For now, take care.